5 years. That's how far back they can look. Not at your medical records, at your money. Everything you gave away, sold, moved, or signed over in the 60 months before the day you finally asked for help paying for care. The check you wrote for your daughter's kitchen. The money you moved into your son's name to keep it safe. The house you put in a trust because somebody at a seminar said you should. All of it, still counted. And nobody tells you the clock started on the day you gave it away, not on the day you needed the help. Here's why this catches people who did exactly what they were told. Almost everyone over 60 has heard some version of the advice. Protect your assets, put things in the children's names, don't let a nursing home take the house. That advice is not wrong. It's the timing that nobody attaches to it. Because protecting assets works when it's done years before anything happens, and it does almost nothing when it's done after the diagnosis, which is the exact moment every family actually starts thinking about it. So a family sits down in a hospital corridor, frightened and trying to do the responsible thing, and makes a series of decisions that feel protective and are, at that point, already too late. Nobody sends a letter when the clock starts. There is no birthday card that says your 5-year window opens today. It opens the moment you're healthy enough not to be thinking about any of this. Today, we're following 3 people through the same decade, from perfectly healthy to needing help, and watching exactly where their paths separate. One thing before we start, I'm not your advisor and I'm not an attorney, and I don't know your state. And on this subject, the state matters more than almost anything else. The rules for who qualifies, what counts, and what happens to a house afterwards are genuinely different depending on where you live. What follows is how the mechanism works, not what you should do. This is the kind of thing to take to somebody licensed in your state, with your actual situation. Harold is 68 and perfectly fine. He's healthy, he's careful with money, he owns his house outright, and he has not thought about long-term care for 1 minute, because he has a belief that almost everybody his age shares, and we'll get to it in a moment. Harold does nothing. Doris is also 68. Doris has thought about it, in the way most people do. She intends to sort it out. She has a will. She's aware that care is expensive. She plans to deal with the details later, when there's a reason to. And Vince is 68 too. Vince spent one afternoon at 68 doing paperwork he did not need. He signed some documents, had a conversation with his children that was uncomfortable, and then nothing happened for 10 years. For a decade, Vince looks like the one who wasted his time. And here is the belief Harold has, that Doris half has, and that is the single most expensive misunderstanding in this entire subject. Harold believes that if he ever needs long-term care, Medicare will pay for it. It will not. Medicare covers medical care. It covers doctors, hospitals, surgery, and it can cover a limited period of skilled nursing after a qualifying hospital stay. That's real, and it's where the confusion comes from, because people know somebody whose mother's rehab was covered. But long-term custodial care, the kind where somebody helps you dress, bathe, eat, and move safely for months or years because you can no longer do those things alone, is not what Medicare is for. That's not a loophole. It was never in the design. Read that again, because most people over 65 believe the opposite, and it's the assumption everything else in this video sits on top of. So if it isn't Medicare, who pays? There are only 3 answers, and everybody ends up in one of them. You pay. Out of savings, out of investments, out of the house. This is what most people do first, and for a certain kind of family, it's the whole plan, and it works. We'll come back to that, because for some of you, this video genuinely doesn't apply. An insurance policy pays if you bought one, which most people didn't, often because they looked at the cost in their 50s and decided to think about it later. Or the state pays. The joint federal and state program that covers long-term care for people whose resources have fallen below a certain level. And that's where the 5 years comes in. Because the state's program is means-tested. It's designed for people who don't have the resources. And to stop people from simply giving everything away the week before applying, there's a review period. When you apply, they look back over the previous 5 years at what you transferred, gave away, or sold for less than it was worth. Transfers inside that window can create a period during which you're not eligible. A stretch of time where you need care, you no longer have the assets because you gave them away, and the program won't cover you yet. The length depends on how much was transferred and on your state. Here's the part almost nobody says out loud. That penalty doesn't land on the person who made the gift. It lands on the family standing in the room when the money is needed, and there isn't any. 2 years in. Harold is fine. Doris is fine. Vince is fine, and has spent 10 minutes total thinking about the documents he signed. Nothing has happened to anyone. This is the entire problem with this subject. The window where action works is the window where nothing is wrong. Harold retires fully. Doris helps her daughter with a house deposit, a generous, ordinary, loving thing that thousands of parents do every year, and that she has every right to do with her own money. Neither of them is doing anything foolish. Write that gift down, though, because it's going to come back. Before we go further, I want to correct a picture, because most people hold one image in their head, and it's the wrong one. When people hear long-term care, they picture a nursing home, a building, a corridor, the worst-case ending. And because that image is so unpleasant, they file the whole subject under things that happen to other people and stop thinking. But care isn't a place. It's a staircase. And most people spend years on the lower steps without ever calling it care. It starts with somebody coming in a few hours a week. Help with the shopping, the cleaning, the shower, the ordinary things that got difficult. Many families never call this care at all. They call it someone comes in on Tuesdays. Then it's most days. Then it's mornings and evenings, because getting up and getting to bed became the hard parts. Then it's a community where help is available around the clock, but you still have your own front door. Then, for some people, and not all, it's the building everybody was picturing. Each step costs more than the one before, and the jump between the last two is the biggest. Why does this matter for the money? Because the staircase is slow. Families adjust one step at a time, absorbing each increase, and rarely stop to add it up. The question, how long can we sustain this, almost never gets asked at step 2, when the answer is still useful. It gets asked at step 4, when the answer is already decided. And there's a second reason. Most of the lower steps are paid for by the family, quietly, out of income. And none of it shows up as a decision anybody made. It shows up as a bank balance that stopped growing, and nobody could quite say when. Now let's talk about the costs that don't appear on any brochure. The first is that care almost never starts with a decision. It starts with an event, a fall, a stroke, a diagnosis that arrives on an ordinary Tuesday. And in the days after that event, a family has to make financial choices in the worst possible conditions, frightened, exhausted, and fast. Every good decision in this subject is made when nothing is happening. Every bad one is made in a hospital corridor. The second hidden cost is the healthy one. When one person in a couple needs care, the money that pays for it is usually the couple's money, which means the person who is still well, still living at home, still doing the shopping, still with 20 years ahead of them, can watch the resources they were both going to live on get consumed by one person's care. There are protections built into the rules for exactly this situation, and they exist precisely because the problem is so predictable. But they're not automatic in the sense of being explained to you. They exist. Somebody has to know to use them, and this is where it starts to get expensive. But the most avoidable part of this whole video is still coming, and it arrives after somebody has died. We'll get there. 10 years later. Harold has a stroke. He recovers partially. He can't be left alone. He needs help with the ordinary things. Every day, indefinitely. The family's first assumption is that Medicare handles it. It handles the hospital. It handles a limited period of rehabilitation afterwards. And then that ends, and someone at the facility explains what happens next, and the family hears the real answer for the first time. In a corridor, on a Thursday. Harold has savings and a house. So Harold pays. That's the honest situation, and for a while it works. Doris receives a diagnosis the same year. Hers is progressive. She's fine now, she will need help later, and everybody knows roughly what the next few years look like. And Doris does what almost every family does at this moment. She acts. She transfers money to her children to protect it. She looks into putting the house in their names. She's being responsible finally, at the exact moment the subject became real. Every one of those transfers is inside the 5 years. Not because she did anything wrong, because the window she needed had already closed, silently, 5 years earlier. And the day it closed, she was completely healthy and had no reason to think about it. Her gift at 73, the house deposit for her daughter, is also inside it. And Vince? Vince also needs help this year. But the documents he signed at 68 are now 10 years old. Everything he did is outside the window. Nothing he arranged is being reviewed because all of it happened in a decade when nothing was wrong. Vince didn't do anything smarter than Doris. He did the same things 10 years earlier. That's the whole video. That's the only difference between them. Now, I've been talking about money, and I want to stop and talk about the part of this that costs almost nothing, and that more families get wrong than any transfer. When Harold had his stroke, somebody had to make decisions for him. Financial decisions and medical ones. If nobody holds the legal authority to do that, the family doesn't simply take over. They go to court to be appointed, a process that takes time and money and happens while somebody is lying in a hospital bed at the exact moment the family has the least of both. The documents that prevent this are ordinary. A financial power of attorney, so somebody can pay the bills and talk to the bank. A healthcare directive, so somebody can make medical decisions and knows what you'd actually want. And an updated list of who has access to what. These are not asset protection. They don't save a dollar. What they do is stop a family from being locked out of their own situation at the worst possible moment. Vince signed his at 68 in an afternoon. Harold never did. Doris has a will, which is a document about what happens after you die, and does nothing at all while you're alive and unable to sign. That's the confusion I'd most like you to leave with. A will is not a plan for being ill. It's a plan for being dead. Most people have the second and not the first, and the second one is the one you're less likely to need first. 2 years into care. Harold has spent a meaningful part of his savings. His family is now looking at the house and asking a question they don't know the answer to. If the state eventually pays, what happens to it? And here's the part I told you about, the one that arrives after somebody dies. In most states, your home is treated differently from your other assets while you're alive. It may not have to be sold to qualify for help, particularly if a spouse still lives in it. Families hear that and reasonably conclude the house is safe. The house is often not safe. It's deferred. Because after the person who received the care dies, states generally have a process to recover what they spent from the estate. And the largest thing in most estates is the house. So the sequence goes like this. The family is told the house doesn't have to be sold. That's true. Everyone relaxes. Years pass. And then, after the funeral, a claim arrives against the estate, and the children discover that the home they assumed was theirs has to cover a bill they never saw accumulating. Nobody lied to them. Every statement along the way was accurate. It's just that you don't have to sell the house, and your children will inherit the house are two different sentences, and families hear the first one and store the second. The rules for this vary enormously by state. What's recoverable? What's exempt? What protections apply for a surviving spouse or a disabled child? This is the single strongest reason to talk to somebody licensed where you actually live, rather than to anyone on the internet, including me. Let me show you the version that keeps families awake, because it's not the one in the brochures. A couple, both in their late 70s. One needs care. The other is well. The one who is well does what people do. They try to manage at home first. For months, sometimes years, they do the lifting, the washing, the medication, the nights. It saves an enormous amount of money, and it costs something that doesn't appear anywhere: their own health. There is a well-documented pattern where the caregiver's health declines faster than the person being cared for. Then, it becomes impossible, and care begins, and the money starts moving. And the one who is well is now looking at a future where the resources they were both going to live on are being consumed by one person's needs, with no way to say so out loud, because saying it out loud feels like a betrayal of somebody they love. That is the real shape of this problem. Not a nursing home taking a house. A well spouse at 78, doing arithmetic they feel ashamed of doing. The protections that exist for exactly this situation are the most important thing in this entire video, and they are the thing families most often find out about too late. Because to use them, you have to know they exist before you need them. Vince's arrangements at 68 included this. Not because Vince was clever, because somebody licensed asked him a question he wouldn't have thought to ask himself. I mentioned insurance early on and moved past it, and I owe you a proper answer, because it's the option most people dismiss for the wrong reason and buy for the wrong reason. A long-term care policy is a bet, and both sides know it. You pay premiums for years, possibly decades, and if you never need care, you never get anything back. That's not a scandal. That's what insurance is. You buy it for the same reason you insure a house you expect not to burn down. Here's the honest case for it. It's the only instrument that turns an unlimited, unknowable cost into a known one. Care has no ceiling. It can run for 2 years or for 12. A policy puts a number on the thing that otherwise has no number, and for a family in the middle, enough to lose, not enough to absorb. That's genuinely valuable. And here's the honest case against, which the sales conversation tends to skip. Premiums on many older policies were not fixed forever, and holders have seen them increase, sometimes substantially, sometimes years in, at an age when switching is no longer realistic, which produces the outcome nobody plans for. A person pays for 15 years, faces an increase they can't sustain at 80, and lets the policy lapse. Paid for the bet, then walked away before it settled. There are newer products that combine care coverage with something that pays out either way, precisely to solve the "I paid and got nothing" objection. They cost more up front, and they are not simple. What I'd want you to take from this isn't buy or don't buy. It's that the decision has an age attached. Premiums are set by your age and health when you apply, and both move in one direction. Deciding at 60 is a different conversation from deciding at 72, and by the time most people feel motivated to have it, one of the doors has already closed. There's one more thing on Vince's list from that afternoon at 68, and it isn't a document. He told his children what he wanted, not the finances, the actual preferences, whether he'd want to stay at home as long as physically possible, even if it cost more. What he'd find unacceptable. Which of his children he wanted making decisions, and whether the others knew and agreed. That conversation takes an hour and everybody hates it. And here's what it prevents. When a family has to make these decisions without knowing, they don't just make a decision, they argue. One child wants the parent at home, because that's what mom would have wanted. Another does the arithmetic and says it isn't sustainable. A third lives 4 states away and has opinions, but not the burden. And underneath all of it, everyone is frightened, and nobody is saying so. Those arguments happen in every family, and they're not really about money. They're about guilt and about siblings who haven't been in a room together with something this heavy since they were children. A parent who says out loud what they want removes the guilt from the decision, not the sadness. The guilt. The children stop having to guess what their mother would have chosen and start simply doing what she said. That's not asset protection. There's no financial line item for it. But if you ask families who've been through it what they wish they'd had, this is what they say. More often than they say, they wish they'd moved the money. Now let me be honest about who this doesn't apply to, because a lot of people watching are about to worry for no reason. If your assets are modest, there is very little to protect, and this whole subject collapses into something much simpler. The program exists for exactly your situation. You want the documents, the power of attorney, the healthcare directive. But the 5-year transfer question is largely academic, because there's nothing meaningful to transfer. If your assets are large, you're likely to pay for care yourself for as long as it's needed and never approach the program at all. In that case, this video is a documents and preferences conversation, not a protection one. This lands hardest in the middle. Enough to lose, not enough to absorb years of care. That's where the timing genuinely changes the outcome for a family, and it's where the 5 years is worth understanding. And I want to say one more thing plainly, because the internet is full of the opposite. Giving your assets away to your children is not automatically a good idea, and it carries real risks that have nothing to do with the look back. Money in a child's name is exposed to that child's divorce, that child's creditors, that child's judgment. Handing over a house can create a tax outcome for them that is worse than doing nothing. And there is no undo button. The single worst version of this is doing an aggressive thing you read about without advice in the wrong 5 years. That's not planning. That's a gamble with your own security as the stake. So which of these three are you? You might be Harold if you have never seriously asked who pays for long-term care and would have guessed Medicare. That's not ignorance. It's the single most common belief among people your age, and it's wrong. And finding out today, rather than in a corridor, is the entire value of the last 20 minutes. You might be Doris if you know this matters and intend to deal with it. Doris is not careless. Doris is the most common person in this video and the most quietly at risk, because intending to act and acting look identical right up until the day they don't. You might be Vince if you're willing to spend one afternoon on something that has no visible benefit for years, and possibly ever. That's a genuinely hard thing to do, and nobody will thank you for it at the time. Vince's family will never know what didn't happen to them. Most people are Doris. Almost nobody thinks they are. So here's what to actually do. And the first part takes 20 minutes. 1. Find out whether you have a financial power of attorney and a healthcare directive. Not a will, those. If you don't know, you don't have them. That's the cheapest and most important thing on this list, and it has nothing to do with protecting money. 2. Look up the look-back period in your state. 5 years is the general rule. Your state's details are the ones that will actually apply to you. 3. Ask yourself the middle question honestly. Do you have enough to lose, but not enough to absorb several years of care? If the answer is yes, that's the conversation to book with somebody licensed where you live. And now you know exactly what to ask them, which is the part most families can't do. And 4, the hard one. Have the conversation with your children while it's hypothetical. It is a deeply uncomfortable hour. It is also the only version of that conversation that happens without a diagnosis sitting on the table. 5 years. That's where we started. 5 years is how far back they look, and the only version of you who can do anything about it is the version who feels completely fine. Harold wasn't careless. Doris wasn't foolish. They both did reasonable things at reasonable times. The only thing Vince did differently was do them in a decade when there was no reason to. These aren't tricks, and they aren't loopholes. It's a calendar. And the calendar started before anybody told you it had. Take care of yourselves and take care of each other.